Welcome to tonight's seminar sponsored by the Lane County Master Gardeners on climate change. My name is Jan and I will be your host for tonight's seminars. During tonight's seminar, Western Oregon Garden in Climate Confusion, we will explore how gardening is changing as we adjust to climate challenges. It will include impacts and adaptions on annual crops like vegetables and on perennial crops like berries and fruit trees, how to make a garden more climate resistant, and how natural areas are changing. Before we get started, a couple of items. Closed caption is enabled and can be turned off and on with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Also, during this session, everyone will be muted. There will be time for questions during the talk. To ask questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we will answer as many questions as we can. If you have additional questions, please contact your local extension office. When you leave this seminar, you will be asked to fill out a short evaluation. Filling out the evaluation gives us valuable information and it helps us improve what we're doing. So let's get started by introducing tonight's speaker. Chip Bubl, is the Associate Professor and Staff Chair and Extension Horticulturist in Agriculture for Columbia County. He has been serving OSU Extension and the community at large since the late 1970s. Chip was born in Corvallis, received his BS in Botany and Plant Pathology and his Master's in Horticulture. He joined OSU Extension in Columbia County where he works with commercial farmers, large and small, home gardeners, natural resource clientele, and the Master Gardener program. Thanks, Chip.
Thank you very much, Jan. Let's go ahead and get started. So the very first comment I have, and I'm sure this is not new to most of you, but the difference between weather and climate. So weather is just the accumulation of events that could be rain, sunshine, temperatures, the whole gamut of things that we describe when we're talking about the weather we're experiencing. And the climate is basically the incorporation of all that information into a set of terms that define us. So for example, this part of the Pacific Northwest is viewed as a temperate rainforest, as the ultimate climate. If we were to allow everything to revert back to what it was 10,000 years ago, it would be pretty obvious that it was the case. So anyway, so climate is the larger thing, the larger piece, and the weather is the more immediate experiences that you're having. It is important, though, to look at global temperature issues. And it's not very hard to see that as you go to the right end of this graph, the temperatures have been rising at a relatively phenomenal pace, especially since about 1980. And if you look at the coincidence, if you will, the putting the numbers together, both the CO2 emissions and the weather change, you can see that they're tracking very, very closely together. And if you look at the long-term CO2, and we're now looking back in this chart, 800,000 years ago, you can see this oscillation over a long period of time. And then basically in the last 20 to 80 years, the CO2 concentration rising dramatically, way over anything it had done in the previous 800,000 years. So that gives you an indication of kind of where we're at, what's going on. But now we get to look more deeply at what this is going to mean. And so much of this is still a work in progress. We had, if you remember, last year, at least in our county, we experienced on June 28th, 116 degrees. And that was unlike anything we'd ever seen before, ever felt before. We'd had temperatures over 100, had over 105, near 108 before, but nothing like 116 degrees. And then this year, we basically had 3 consecutive Marches, one real one, and then the March of April, and then the March of May. And so we were cooler. We had more rainfall this April than we'd had in the 3 previous Aprils combined. So one of the impacts potentially of climate change is a greater instability in weather patterns. I look at a lot of different weather forecasts. I work with NOAA. I look at NOAA fairly often, both their short-term and long-term forecasts. And I do feel for them because they are in kind of uncharted territory themselves. There's definitely the tendency to have weather forecasts that may be less reliable for the near term until at least we get more of a handle on how we can understand what's going on. I think we'll see more geographic variation in impacts in a given year. And the instability of what's going on will affect crops and natural areas. And I go back to 2015 in the north end of, near Portland and where I work and live, and in the Portland metropolitan area and the agricultural areas around it. We had some farmers that, noticing the relatively warm March they were having and noticing the long-term projections for those next month or two, which were pretty firm in what they were going to be, decided they were going to plant sweet corn for fresh market March 20th. They could get on the ground, they could plant it. They did that. It worked. They were harvesting their sweet corn the first week in July. So this instability can have some positive effects, if you will, and some potentially deeply negative effects, as we'll talk about as we go along. So the instability is going to be just part of what we're having to adapt to as people living here. So this rate of climate change is clearly different than any other event that has been around in a long time. The challenge is the speed of warming is going to impact native landscapes and all the species living within them. One of the things that has concerned me over the last 4 to 5 years, and I'm not sure if you're experiencing this in your coastal coast range, lower elevation coast range situations or not, but we have lost a tremendous number of Western red cedars. And looking deeply into the biology of what's going on, looking for any disease issues, root disease issues, or some other kind of vascular issues with the Western red cedar, there is nothing. What it has been, apparently, has been a level of soil moisture in the spring that was too low to support them. And so, again, we've lost a number of them. Now, this year, we may have saved a few because we had a tremendous amount of moisture coming into summer this year in our soil profile, but we haven't had that. And so it's going to be affecting things in ways that we cannot yet totally predict. And species that reproduce slowly, or which we're managing, will have the most trouble adapting, no question. So how do plants respond to a climate change? Well, one sort of tragic example is going on in the Rockies right now, where one particular conifer, a pine, basically could go to the seed that got drifted or moved to higher elevations, those trees would not be affected by a particular boring insect and boring beetle, but the ones at lower elevation were. So they had this sanctuary, if you will, of a zone that was too cold for the insect. But they've gone as high as they can go, and it's still warm enough for the insect to survive. And so the long-term outlook for this particular tree is not good at all right now. So we talk about evolution and selection pressure. This is basically the distribution of seeds with the sort of changing genetics that every seed carries with it. And hopefully there'll be some changes that can help with those plants as they attempt to survive and move into the future. But that is going to be a challenge for some. There are some plants that actually have genes that haven't been expressed before or haven't been noticed before that given a stress situation, all of a sudden they're there and the plant can maintain itself through kind of a silent set of genes up to that point. So anyway, there's some real interesting stuff, but becoming extinct is not out of the question at all in a lot of cases. If you look at what makes it more challenging for a plant in a native landscape, physical barriers, a big issue. A complex reproduction process can make it more and more challenging if the climate may be affecting the pollinators, which could be, it could be insects, it could be amphibians, it could be, there's lots of different things that can affect the reproduction process. Having very specific environmental requirements, a very, very finely defined niche, very low gene flow. In other words, there's not much movement from other nearby populations, so there's a low gene flow, and then very limited dispersal mechanisms. And these plants that I think you all know from Florence are ideal examples of plants that probably have niche complications and could be in trouble given the long term. So I think we can agree that not all species will adapt to climate change at the same rate. Plants that flower too early may miss their pollinators. Migrating birds might not have a food supply where and when they expect it. And we're going to come back to this one on birds in a minute, because actually there's a lot of changes going on and a lot of data coming out on how birds are handling some of these issues. Looking at one element of the changing climate is the updating, if you will, of the hardiness model, the hardiness map. And if you remember, I'm sure you all do as master gardeners, that zone 1 represents a very cold winter. This is like Duluth, Minnesota, and zone 20 is tropical or subtropical. And then everything in between are the different growing conditions and cold, extreme cold event conditions in the landscape across North America. And so it's really focused on the kinds of plants that winter over. In other words, woody and herbaceous perennials and biennials. So when we're looking at the hardiness zone, we're looking at how they survive winter, which is a key plant thing. What we're finding is that we have moved in the Willamette Valley, which, where I work and live is the northern end of it. We've moved from what was a 7B to now an 8A or 8B, depending upon location. This has nothing to do with annuals, because we grow a lot of tropical annuals, but we don't care about it because at the end of the year, at the end of the growing season, they're going to die. That's what they're supposed to do. They're annuals. So this is all about both native and non-native woody and herbaceous perennials and biennials. The one thing we don't have yet that became poignantly obvious last summer was we didn't have no heat zone tolerance model. We had a lot of trees that showed damage. Many of those trees, especially, it was mostly concentrated on the southwest side of conifers, where they got the direct rays of the sun at the hottest time of the day. But a lot of other plants were affected as well. It is clear that we may need to begin looking at heat tolerance zones for different plants to understand what we need to be putting in for a longer term cycle on some of these landscapes or natural areas. So this was a wake-up call this last year with regard to heat tolerance, and something that it became very clear we need to know more about. And here's the map of the zones, and you can see Eugene sitting right here. And basically, I think on this map, you're listed as an 8B. So what that basically says is, on average, and there can be exceptional winters, you are not likely to have temperatures that go much lower than 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's kind of your lower limit. When we were listed as 7B, it was 5 to 10 degrees. And in my time frame, we actually had 2 years back to back. I think they were 89 and 90, where we got down in our location down to around 0 or 5 degrees. So it is not for sure yet that we're completely out of that, but the odds are now reduced that those kind of temperatures are going to show up as often as they did previously. So here are some of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about in terms of climate change impact in gardening: frost-free intervals, growing degree days, pollination, heat and disease changes, weed impacts, water for gardening, plant choices, and cultural landscape choices. I'll stop briefly here or go to the next one, but does anyone have any questions right at this point? No.
No. Somebody asked, I think this is when you were talking about, could this be caused by UV?
Could it be caused by what now?
UV light.
UV. You mean some of the heat damage?
Yes.
Yeah, potentially. Actually, potentially, that's not impossible. That is not impossible because there was virtually nothing in the air. It wasn't a humid heat. It was a dry heat. Yeah, it's a good question. Don't know for sure the answer on that. That's an interesting question. Okay. Anything else?
I have my apple trees loaded with blooms, then a freeze, now not an apple on my tree.
Yeah, yes. This was a terrible year. There's very little fruit up where I live and work this year too, for exactly the same issues you went through. You probably didn't get the 7 inches of snow though in early April that we got. So that was a big surprise. It was heavy water loaded snow, but it was yeah, no, this has been not pleasant this year. This has been a year to forget in gardening, I would say, or yeah, it was, you know, again, 3 straight marches aren't a good idea. So I'm going to move forward a little bit now. And so one of the interesting things that gardeners have always been concerned with is the average last spring frost and the first fall frost. And that gives us what we call our growing season length. And what is now being taken into consideration is the fact that certain parts of the country, this has changed. And basically in our Pacific Northwest, they've upped that interval, if you will, by 16 days. So let's see what that means in terms of some of the locations that you might know. So these numbers, the last spring frost, the first fall frost on the left there, these are sort of the historic averages that, for example, in Portland on the 20th of April, it is increasingly less likely you'll have a frost. And then on the other side, before going earlier into April, it was increasingly likely you would more have a 32-degree frost. So it doesn't say it won't occur after the 20th, but it's increasingly less likely. You're sort of halfway through the risk issues at that point in time. So then, though, if you change that map to match the 16-day increase in intervals, and you do it evenly by reducing or pushing the last spring frost back 8 days and pushing the first fall frost back up 8 days, you end up with numbers like this. For Portland, 420, before, now 412, the last spring frost, 1031, now maybe 11.7. And I will say in the Portland metropolitan area, we have gone through a number of years where we haven't gotten the first fall frost until Thanksgiving or later. So that says something. Eugene numbers I picked out before I put this portion of the talk together. Your historic data was pretty similar to ours, 422 for the last spring frost, and the 19th of October, which was a little earlier in ours, for the average first fall frost. So you can see this kind of thing can make a big difference in terms of how farmers or gardeners are viewing the landscape for planting and for preparing garden crops or commercial crops. Remember, though, again, these numbers are just averages, they're not absolutes. So I'm sure you get them too if you're working in one of the plant clinics where people will call up and just ask, when are we going to have our last spring frost? Well, okay, you can't say that. You have no way of knowing, but you do know the odds, and that's what we talk about. So, but the other thing that's interesting, and maybe something you're less familiar with, is growing degree days. And growing degree days are used a lot in deciding which varieties to plant of particular crops, which wine varieties will do well in X location versus in another location. They're guaranteed more likely to mature in location A than location B because it's the right mix or the right match in terms of growing degree days for that. And typically what the growing degree day cycle does is it starts on April 1 and goes to October 31st. And what it is using a base 50. What it is, you take the average of the two temperatures, the high and the low for a given day starting April 1. So for example, on April 1, if it was 58 high, 50 low, that would be 108 total, divide by 2, that would be 54, and then subtract 50 from it, so it gave you 4 growing degree days. Does that make sense? So if it was 70 and 50, that would be 120 days, or 120 degree days divided by 2 would be 60. 60 minus 50, you'd have 10 growing degree days on that particular day. And this just accumulates then for every day between April 1 and October 31st. And what can allow farmers to do is predict when certain crops may be ripe and to be ready to be harvested and to be ready to be shipped or processed, whatever's going on. The other thing that it can be used for, there are an awful lot of insects that time their movement into a crop. For example, the codling moth laying an egg on the apple, time that movement by measuring in the quintessential intelligence of insects, the growing degree days, so that they're not coming out before there's an apple formed to lay their egg on, formed enough for them to lay their egg on. So we can actually create growing degree day structures for the maturity of certain crops. We can also create it for we have created it, and it's available from OSU, for predicting when to start spraying for a particular insect. Historically, we've used that information on codling moths to normally say, well, you start spraying for codling moths, if you're going to spray for codling moths, maybe a month after full bloom. But this gives it a little bit more vigor and exactness to it in terms of how the insect will actually respond. At least, and here's where the caveat starts to rumble in, at least with the current understanding of their relationship to this climate. So one of the interesting things when I was having to go up to Hood River and give a vegetable talk, which I talked about growing degree days there, I got looking at the history of their growing degree day averages. And I found a place where I could get, data from 2000 to 2020, and then data from 1999 back to 1980, basically. So I had 20-year cycles on both of them. And the interesting thing to me was that prior to the mid-1920s, but especially, the 2020s, prior to that, they only had 2 or 3 days that were above 2000. After that, they had only a few days that were lower than 2000, through a few years that were lower than 2000. So that's a pretty dramatic piece of evidence that at least in this location, in this point in time, the climate is definitely moving and altering the agricultural and gardening and human landscape, really, if you will. So some of the implications actually for Oregon of more frost days and more heat units is that it may actually increase the kinds of crops that a specialty farmer or a larger commercial farmer could grow, assuming, and this is Western Oregon, assuming the soil drainage is okay to work. And that was the big challenge this year with both commercial farmers and gardeners, with all the rain that we had, having the soil drain easily enough to be able to be worked soon. So anyway, but there are some interesting implications a little bit that we'll come back to a little bit later, but of more opportunity to grow different crops than had been grown before. I did hear last year that somebody in Alaska for the first time grew and matured a crop of okra. And if that doesn't boggle the imagination, I don't know what will. But anyway, I think some interesting things are going on that are potentially beneficial to some extent to the farming community in this location in the Willamette Valley. However, heat waves. Now, this is not necessarily the picture there of the pumpkins. This is not necessarily a heat wave issue in this case. If you've grown any of these crops, the cucurbits, they drop their leaves at a moment's notice when they think it's too hot. And the way you know that they're not running short of water is that they're back to normal the next morning, pretty much. And if they don't come back to normal, you are potentially in a drought stress situation, or you have a root disease, or both. So, but heat waves are projected to become more common and persistent. And clearly this will have a huge impact on farms and gardens, water sources, energy for greenhouses, just irrigation issues, irrigation amounts, volumes, that kind of thing, huge issue. So the other thing is that it has a huge human issue. And I feel with the gardeners that I work with up here, they are not yet really savvy to how things seem to be changing in terms of their working environment outside in the garden during the heat of the summer. And Australia modeled, they modeled kind of what they call routine outdoor activities, and found that currently there's 4 to 6 days where outdoor activities were not possible for non-acclimated people. People that have, the acclimated people were people that have been spending their time outdoors most of the time, all the time. By 2070, they are predicting that will increase to 35 to 40 days in a year. So that is a significant issue in terms of human health. We haven't looked yet to the best of my knowledge, in any of the land, any of the areas, the Willamette Valley, Eastern Oregon, other parts of the country. We really haven't looked for what this actually means over time very much, at least that I've seen. But I think it's something that we do need to look at, because it is a human health issue. And I really care about my gardeners. And I think they sometimes push themselves in ways that they shouldn't, just because they're gardeners and they want to get it done and they love it. So anyway, we need to look more at this, I think. Some high temperature issues that I'm sure many of you saw last year. We do get sunburn on a variety of crops. The things I saw most were, I didn't see it on cucumbers so much last year, but I did see it on pepper. If you got your peppers in really early, there were people that had peppers that were fruiting that were damaged by that late June frost, or late June heat dome. We definitely saw a bunch of sunburn on apples. So those are the kinds of things that can happen in some of the warmer temperatures that we experience in gardens and in commercial crops. To a certain extent, we can manage some of the impacts by really conscious irrigation, sometimes some overhead irrigation to create more of a humidity barrier around it. We can do variety selection to give more leaf cover if you think this is going to be a permanent type of problem. Planting dates to get you past it, but I think the June thing last year really blasted that concept, because that was so unpredictable. And then sun blocking materials. I'm sure many of you have used row covers before, and we'll be coming back to them a little bit later, but sun blocking materials, row covers can be that. And I had a couple of people when we had that 200 to 6 or 116 degree temperatures late June last year, who called me and asked me a couple of days ahead of time, well, can I put some row covers up over some of these things that I want to protect? He did, and it worked. And some stuff that otherwise I think would have gotten really toasted did not. So it can actually be a little bit of a heat blocker to some extent as well, heat reflector. Some other things you'll see, and certainly saw last year in some of the hot weather, corn wasn't probably ready in most cases, but some people, because it had been an early season, had tomatoes that were already starting to set fruit and ripen, except that they stopped. So typically when you get temperatures above about 92 degree Fahrenheit, and this is really variable with tomatoes, because we have some tomatoes that were raised for processing in the San Joaquin Valley where 100 degrees is almost common for months, for weeks at a time in parts of the San Joaquin Valley where they grow tomatoes for processing. But the ones we tend to grow at about 92 degrees or a little more, they will not necessarily set fruit or seed. It won't kill the plant, but you'll have this gap in fruit set with beans, tomatoes, and rarely with corn. So those are some things to be alert to and pay attention to. The other thing that happens is that the growth rate on most crops will slow dramatically where temperatures are above 95. And basically, the plant is in a stress response. It's saying shut down. So they shut down. So they shut down their stoma. They're reducing their water loss. But in shutting down the stoma during the day, for as long as they're doing what they're doing, is not allowing oxygen to get into the system and CO2 to get into the system to be able to be used in the photosynthetic process. So that does effectively stop the carbohydrate production and the growth of the plant for a period of time. And then, as I'm sure most of you are profoundly aware, there are lettuce varieties that, and quite a few other greens that do not do well as temperatures even get near 90 degrees. So I know there's some breeding going on by at least one breeder in the Willamette Valley who sells to small farmers and home gardeners and things like that to try to get some varieties that are of lettuce that are less liable to bolt and less liable to get bitter as the temperatures go up. And so he's made some significant progress, and there are some varieties out there that have a little bit more heat stability, but I do think it's going to be part of a breeding objective over the next few years to look for this as something important in plant breeding. Any questions at this point? I'll give a little bit of a break at this point.
There's one question in here.
Sure.
Was your example of degree days the number of degree days for a single day, or DD? No,
that was for the whole April 1 to 10/31. It was the whole number of days added together to give a total number of degree days. Yeah.
And the other part of the question was, and our total of 2715 equal the total for all the days for April through October?
Yes.
Okay. And the last part of this question is there a place where we can look up the degree day required by crops we like to grow, such as tomato variety?
You know, it's interesting because it is sort of embedded a little bit, even though it's not called that, in the days to harvest. So for example, and on tomatoes are so complicated. But for example, in corn, you'll have 65-day corn like sugar bonds, and then you'll have like a 76-day corn like bodacious, and then you'll have some 81-day corns or even later sweet corns. And so those are in essence kind of the degree day concept turned into something that's reasonably rational for a gardener to look at, or even a farmer to look at and understand, given and so what that's based is given an average year that represents the average degree days over this thing. What's challenging right now is how fast the degree days are changing. And so what might be a 72-day corn now might end up being a 69-day corn in a couple of 5 years. same variety, same location, changing climate. So this, again, this is a very fluid thing that's going on right now. Fluid, very fluid.
And somebody's, let's see, what was the other? There's a couple more questions in here, but how will this all affect crop pests?
And we're getting to that.
Okay, thought you probably would be.
Yes. Okay, let me keep going a little bit.
Okay.
Some other things that are, again, these are things that are puzzling a little bit to us. So looking at natural areas, this is a big leaf maple. If enough moisture is present and we're warmer, there would be a faster turnover of organic matter in the soils. We don't know exactly what that is going to mean in terms of some of these soils. If there's less moisture that's combined with higher temperatures, there will be a slower turnover. So again, what does this really mean? We expect to see changes in soil, soil living species of the zillions of different things that live in our soils and in their relative amounts, their diversity, their distribution. We hardly know what's there already. And now we're going to be seeing changes, but since we're not really sure how much is there in many cases already, we may not know how it's changing. But it is clear that the increasing dryness potentially and the increasing temperatures will change some of that. And then another interesting thing that's been happening, so many trees are what we call mycorrhizal. In other words, they have a direct interconnected relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. Some of them make the things we call mushrooms. But what we don't know is if a tree gets stressed, will that affect the mycorrhizal relationship in a bad way? Or maybe the stressed trees will be aided by the mycorrhizal fungi, or a different mycorrhizal fungi may take over in a stress situation. We don't know. This is sort of walking in uncharted territory. We wonder about trees. Will they sequester more carbon through more vigorous growth starting earlier? That's quite possible. That would be, helpful in terms of slowing the pace of climate change. But there's a lot of questions about whether or not trees may be more prone to damage from early spring cold temperatures. And we'll talk in a second about how this might come by. But fall leaf drop, which kind of ends the tree sequestration, is typically a day length driven thing, whereas leafing out is not a day length driven thing. So anyway, fall leaf drop is a day length driven thing. And that shouldn't change. That shouldn't be changing much because day lengths don't change. Although again, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. And then forest floor vegetation and higher species may be affected if there are changes in leaf drop timing and volume. We're just not knowing what this is going to mean. So looking at the issues of winter and getting through winter, hardy plants have to get through winter. So what happens in the fall is that they sense a certain degree day change, and this is the day length issue. And in response to that, each tree has kind of its own trigger, but they start that process where they start to take all the chlorophyll out of their leaves and send it down into their, and reuse it, sending it down into their root system to be the carbohydrates taken apart and used for other things next year, stored basically. And slowly but surely, they go through this process of shutting down, dropping the leaves, hardening the buds, and basically getting ready to withstand winter. How they come out of winter has nothing to do with day length. But when they come out of winter, it is the tree responding to certain temperatures below 46, and they're actually measuring what we call the number of chilling hours. And once that number that's specific for that particular tree species or tree cultivar in some cases is met, then if it warms up, this plant, this tree, the shrub, if you will, woody plant, can then the buds start to swell and we end up getting what we call bud break. And then the tree is ready to resume spring growth. What we are concerned about is that chilling hours is kind of a challenging thing, because if we start losing our chilling hours, it's not sure exactly how some of these trees are going to respond. I'm going to skip this one. What we're worried about is that they may end up starting to come out too early, but it might still get cold before them. If the tree is not sufficiently chilled, or in some cases, plants like strawberries, the fruit can come out looking abnormal because the floral structure has been challenged, if you will. And then the other question is, will the bloom be in sync with pollinator emergence if we're talking about, say, native plants? So there's a lot of stuff going on here that we don't really know how, bud break timing and weather issues play into each other. The very worst situation that I ever saw in terms of freeze injury was trees that had satisfied their chilling requirement by mid-January and were ready then to, if the temperature warmed up, to come out. But usually the temperature doesn't warm up. Unfortunately, that January, in the last week of January, we got temperatures that were in the low 50s to low 60s for a whole week, basically. And then the week after that, it went down to 5 degrees. What had happened was a lot of plants had come out of dormancy, had started to basically reawaken for spring, and got hit with extreme cold. And we had trees that spent 5 years to die, but die they did because it was tragic. So we do not know exactly whether we'll have any of those extreme cold events anymore, but we also don't know how well this bud break timing is going to work with fruit pollination and chilling damage coming out. So some other things, we're following. Domesticated honeybees have issues, the varroa mite, although hopefully we've got some treatments that are going to help with that. They're generally good pollinators, generalist pollinators. Our native species, a lot of them have fairly good host ranges. Our bumblebees, some of our other native bees, and those kinds of things are fairly good pollinators. We're not sure whether drought will reduce activity. We think it might. It could concentrate insecticides in pollen or nectar. That would not be good, but we don't know that yet. And I'm going to skip roses. I usually get some rose questions, and roses are so complicated because of their genetics. But I will say there's so much interest in roses. We will also always have roses. I think you can count on that. There'll be a rose for every climate. But there may be some roses, especially native roses, that struggle in some of this as we go forward. One other thing that we don't worry about with vegetables, but we surely worry about with native plants is seed dormancy. And typically they'll measure the passage of cold just like the tree does, the number of degrees below a certain threshold. And then when that is met, the seed is in essence primed or ready to germinate given the right conditions in terms of temperature and moisture. So were that to change, were the winter temperatures to be milder, it could end up creating some confused seeds, if you will, in terms of when they germinate and whether it's safe to germinate. So I do think that weeds, some of our winter annuals, but especially some of our early spring to summer annuals, will also be affected by some of these temperatures because they definitely respond to soil temperatures for germination. Weeds are really good at what they do, and it's typically due to a high reproductive rate. And with that high reproductive rate, they can catapult themselves into the future without too much difficulty. So looking at some of the more complex systems we have, we do think that insects that weren't pests could become crop pests because they are adapted to a new climate. That's a possibility. We may see some native insects move to extinction. That's definitely a possibility for a variety of reasons: moisture, predation, lack of preferred food, a whole bunch of things that could move some native species. We talked a little bit about the codling moth and whether it can synchronize as the climate changes a little bit with laying its egg in the apple at the right time. So there's a lot of behavior based on temperature and some on day length, even in the behavior of insects. What we don't want to see on some, like spotted wing Drosophila and cabbage aphids and things like that, what we would rather not see is a tremendous increase in generations, but that is not impossible. If you've been following the news, we have some very good news on the spotted wing Drosophila, basically with the introduction of a parasitoid that, not the introduction, but the completion of the research on this parasitoid and its potential ability to be raised and released to control spotted wing Drosophila, which has been a huge issue with our commercial small fruit growers. It has been a nasty, nasty problem for them over the last few years. Anyway, so we are definitely concerned, though, about some insects being able to take huge advantage of climate change. This is a brief, the little chart there is basically a sign, a diagram of the Western tent caterpillar and the virus that basically takes it back down. And you'll see that right now they're fairly in sync. We really have no idea how that's going to fare in climate change, whether they'll stay in sync or not. Right now, it's a good indigenous biological control for that particular insect. I definitely think, although this year is going to be the exception, I definitely think there'll be more yellow jackets and ball-faced hornets over time. That could have some benefits might have better insect predation, also could increase the number of stings that people experience. There is one interesting thing, though, with ball-faced hornets, and they basically have a 122-day interval between when they build, the queen starts building the nest, and when the colony ends. And I wasn't really aware of how this was working until about 3 or 4 years ago in one of those early springs. I noticed some of these ball-faced hornet nests were dying basically the first part of August. And I looked to see whether there was a predator, whether something was going on, looked into it in more detail. This thing has a timing mechanism. This insect has a timing mechanism. And why it had value, I have no idea, but 122 days, 124 days is about it for them. So anyway, there you go, a little bit of ball-faced hornet tree. Here's one thing that we're watching, but there's actually a good side to this story, and that is that historically birds have shown up in certain places to lay their eggs, the date of hatching, and timing the hatching with the food that it needs, which often is an insect that the larvae, in most cases, that's showing up at that particular point in time. So when they're in a perfect match, like you see on the upper and lower things on the left, all is well. When they are out of sync, when hatching is further to the right and the peak mass of the larvae that the birds feed on is to the left, that is a mismatch and could lead to a problem with the bird succeeding in hatching its replacement. So the interesting thing we found out is birds are showing up about 2 weeks earlier than they used to in most parts of the United States if they're migratory birds. So that I think I think the birds are working on that. That's what I would say. Plant diseases, this is also super unknown. A lot of diseases, you're probably aware, have fairly specific host ranges, moisture, temperature ranges, those kinds of things for infection. We have no idea how this is going to change. All we can do is watch. What we do know, and somebody asked this earlier, is about our weeds. And weeds, as I mentioned, are extraordinarily good at what they do. and their ability to reproduce quickly and effectively occupy space to take over space, in essence, from other plants is pretty astonishing. We do know that some of the plants that really respond just to an increased CO2 enriched environment are some of the worst weeds we have. Canada thistle, poison oak makes more of what makes you itch in a CO2 enriched environment. We know that some annuals, particularly amaranth, pigweed, does very well in an enriched CO2 environment. Partially, for those of you who are kind of botany geeks, it's what we call a C4 plant. And so anyway, these plants will do much better, but we are seeing weed shifts already. We're seeing plants that we didn't see before, partially because they were introduced and they hadn't been here before. A plant called mare's tail is one that is showing up on our clear cuts and has for the last 20 years that was period not here 20 years ago, before that. So anyway, I think we have a good idea of how it got here, but it's definitely having an impact on quite a few areas. So a lot of this, though, are the issues that come down to water, because along with warmer temperatures, we are concerned of the moisture pattern that we're going to have in these landscapes and these farms. And what we think we know at this point is in parts of Western Oregon, our stream flows are going to be relatively okay, and parts they may not be. And I guess I'll leave it at that for a second. The other thing, though, that we're concerned about is that it is predicted there will be a series of higher intensity storms, which seems to show that you're getting a higher rainfall, but you're ending up with less because you're increasing your runoff in a short cycle. So this is just a graph of showing the current stream flow. Historical stream flows is the dark line on top. And then as you go further forward in time, you see that the stream flow moves further back and ends faster. And that is going to have impacts for sure on things that depend on streams and farming. If you look at this map, it actually shows that in terms of stream flow trends, we are actually projected to be okay compared to a lot of other places. So it may not be the worst thing in the world in this particular part of the country. This is why there are people from California looking a lot in the Willamette Valley right now for land. I'm going to skip this as an example of a town that's experienced everything from absolutely no water in their main water supply, a little tributary of the Nahalem called Rock Creek, Vernonia, no water at all, basically, and one that had one of the highest floods that have been in Oregon in a long time. So water is going to be a big deal. We're going to have to learn how to deal with less water. There are ways to use the expanded seasons, but an expanded growing season may end up leading to more water uses. We will definitely have to learn a lot more about drip irrigation and how to use it. We will definitely have to learn a lot more about compost and how to use it in landscapes and farms, how to use cover crops, because the advantage of some of these things are they can hold moisture better, retain it in the soil without actually creating a soggy soil situation, which is what we don't want. So some of the choices, how much do we want lawns, green lawns all summer? Lawns actually sequester carbon, but they also take a lot of water. Good, bad, indifferent? Are there other ways to use the space? Gardeners I know are spending a lot of time thinking about these right at this point. Should they plant things that are for pollinators? Should they plant things that are supporting birds and some of the insects the birds like? You want it comforting, you want it beautiful. What do you do? I think one thing that's pretty clear is there may be some value in plants being grouped by water needs as you go along with planting them. So that I think is going to be a big change for people going forward. You all know this, I'm sure. This is just a profile of sand, silt, and clay, and But what I wanted to talk about here is in terms of compost and cover crops and adding organic matter. I think this is a super important thing. We have had one major problem in sort of the commercial providing of compost, and that is that it has been what we call immature compost. The problem with immature compost is that it's going to need, or it will gather whatever nitrogen is in the soil and move that nitrogen away from your crop and into the mouths of all those zillions of little things that are continuing the composting process in the ground. And so you end up having to provide the wrong term, really provide enough nitrogen to both support the composting process and support the crop. And if you do that, everything will work out fine. There's a huge movement to use less peat in terms of seed starting media and to use coir or truly finished compost as potting alternatives. And there's been a revolution in electronic equipment for gardens and landscapes. So that's a super important thing to look at down the line, because that definitely is carbon saving. I think being prepared in the spring to start early vegetables will help in terms of what you can produce and have for your own, or you can give to the food bank or to friends or whatever. So I think with the increase in our frost-free intervals and our warmer growing degree days, you may be able to do a lot more than you did before. So that could have some positive beneficial things, both for your own health and nutrition, but also what can be offered in the community as well. We are experimenting with crops grown without irrigation at OSU. I think the main thing we have learned out of that is that the soil has to be pretty good and pretty deep so the roots can get down quickly. It works pretty well with tomatoes and peppers and dry beans and some winter squash, garlic, rhubarb, it's always worked with. We are looking at other crops as well, but the key things are deep soil, get them into the ground as early as you can, and do not let a single weed take a single drop of moisture from that soil. So it can work, it's tough, but it is being done in actually the near Eugene in some cases. So it's a work in progress, but there's been a lot of decent work done on this. Talking about planting lawns that require less water, the so-called eco lawn is a mix of grass and some broadleaves. It was developed at Oregon State University. Usually the broadleaf plants are a yarrow, a microleaf clover, and some special varieties of English lawn daisy. So those are all very useful, I think, and very positive in terms of being able to help out in the carbon equation of your own particular landscape. And then planting trees and shrubs, always a good thing. They capture carbon and may reduce the need for air conditioning if you put them right. So we do want to be somewhat cognizant of using plants that support native species, but we can do a variety of plants. We can plant a variety of plants adapted to our dry summers if they're also adapted to our wet winters. And there's where it gets complicated, because some of the really drought tolerant plants from other parts of the country we might get do not like our clay soils that are water saturated. So kind of investigate that with the plants you're looking at before you make a purchase on some of these drought tolerant perennials. Native plants, always great. I can talk for hours on the plants that are both attractive and profoundly functional for our landscape. So that's a whole nother conversation. But and the whole idea, and this is the last piece that's complicated, except for a few quick things I want to talk about right at the end. Right plant, right place. We've always said it. We thought we knew what it means. Right now, we're not so sure. We're all going to win some and lose some in our plant choices. That's gardening, but that's how we learn. And so with the change in climate, you'll be gathering information that'll be useful to yourself and to other people. So keep notes, find out what's going on that's right, finds out what's going on that's not right, and work from there. Okay, and I'm going to skip the tree thing. So I just want to talk now. This is just 2 pages of things that I think we'll be spending more time learning about. Drip irrigation, I've already mentioned. Mulches, I didn't. There's a lot of renewed interest in using very coarse mulches, like arborist mulches, where they've taken down a tree or a shrub or something like that and shredded it. Those kinds of more coarse mulches are being used. One disadvantage of mulches for anyone that loves ground nesting bees are that you often reduce the availability of for the ground nesting bees. But again, mulches are a good and positive thing. On trees and shrubs, make sure they're about 6 inches away from the base of the trees and shrubs. So in terms of raised beds, you all know the benefit of that, getting onto the soil early because it drains better. We've already talked about planting perennial material together, row covers and shade cloth, the value of that. Cold frames I really like because you can do a bunch of seedlings and get them to the right size and get them out into the garden under your row covers pretty quick, and that's super important. Soil thermometers, I'm sure you've all seen the UC Davis table that was produced about now 40 years ago of how long it takes for given vegetable plant seeds to get to the soil surface, appear on the soil surface at different soil temperatures. And one classic example we think of peas as a winter crop or very early spring crop. But at 40 degrees, 40 degree soil temperature, it takes them about 32 days to come out of the ground. And if you're up to 50 degrees, they're coming out in 12. That's a big difference, and it has an impact on whether you actually get that pea or not, if it comes out of the ground that much faster. Moisture meters, you'll learn how to use them. They'll be very useful. I won't talk about vegetable grafting, although this is being used to get heat and drought tolerance, especially with tomatoes. And if you're interested in this, Ohio State University has a great tutorial on vegetable grafting, which is fascinating. And right now they're mainly using eggplant rootstocks for tomatoes. So you get the variety you want, but with one that's disease resistant and maybe more heat or drought tolerant. So, and a couple last things, learn to trap moles. Moles do not help around root systems, and they are the bane of a vegetable garden, also because they allow the field mice, which are now at dramatic highs, to work on your plants as well. So moles can be a pain. They are a pain in a vegetable garden. Otherwise, I kind of admire them. But beyond that, vegetable garden, no. I like actually the concept. I know a couple of people that are doing this who are actually getting out with headlamps to nail slugs and snails, but actually do work when it cools down. And so I think it's a good plan and probably deserves more attention. Windbreaks, not many situations that demand that, but sometimes it can make a big difference if you are on a really windy site. That can reduce the moisture stress for your plant materials. And it could be a living windbreak, or it could be, the kind of fence that would do a windbreak. And the last is kind of humorous. Learn to dry sun crops like they do in the Mediterranean, and then work late in the evening, get up early to garden, and sleep in the middle of the day like they do in the Mediterranean. And then finally, be heat health alert for yourself, your friends, loved ones, pets, and local wildlife. So I think I'm a little late in terms of a few minutes, but I hope it was okay. And I'd be more than willing to answer any questions you have at this end of the cycle.
One question.
Sure.
Will winters be as harder now in climate change like we've seen in the last few years?
Now, what was the first part? Will what be?
Winter.
So this is why it's really, really crazy. I mean, our winters definitely have been getting, in general, warmer, but I mean, because I don't think where I live, we've had temperatures below about 24 for at least 10 years. which is not true of what had been before. In fact, 2008, when we had 20 inches of snow on our house, we had temperatures around 15. So, and we're not at high elevation. We're at about 250 feet elevation. So we don't know. This is the challenge with climate change. We can't predict the weather as efficiently as we did. I mean, we did not expect 6 inches of snow in the first week in April up here. And it took down a number of trees that had leafed out, either took off big limbs or so yes, in general, I would argue that this is why the hardiness zone map has moved up to 8B, because we're not expecting those 5 to 10 degrees anymore. But I think that zone between maybe 15 and 25 is open game still. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Would it help to block out the sun a bit using a UV tarp? Do you know what those are?
I have not used those, and I don't know for sure. But after the earlier question on UV light and its impact, I have written that down to find out more about that.
Okay. And would adding water crystals to the soil help?
You mean crystal that will absorb water and hold it there? And then re-release it. Yeah, I'm assuming that's what you mean. Yeah, those have been used historically in some transplanting, and they've shown to have some benefit. I think in general, if you have fully composted additions to add to your soil, that can do some of the same things with also some biological values. But yeah, the crystals could, in a transplant stress. What you really want to do is, when you're transplanting something, reduce the stress as much as you can. In fact, one thing I didn't talk about was I'm getting to be more convinced that doing some fall transplanting is a good idea, because the plants are already starting to kind of check out for the winter, and you still have usually a decent opportunity with some nice weather in October to maybe do some installations or moving some things around. And so I'm tentatively thinking that fall transplanting might be more valuable than we've thought it was before. So yeah, there are some options there though, for sure, to make that more successful.
Okay. Well, that looks like all the questions. So thanks so much, Chip, for your
absolutely. I
a great
it.
presentation and lots of valuable information there.
So. Okay. Well, I enjoyed it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just a reminder as you leave the seminar to fill out the short evaluation. And thanks everybody for being here tonight.
Okay.
Thanks.